Today, we are going to be discussing life and death. That's right, this channel's taking a philosophical turn, and I thought we'd start with the easiest question in the universe. What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to die? What's the point of all of it? Round it out with a long meditation on our own mortality. I'm just kidding. Life and Death is the name of a Twilight book. In fact, I conveniently have it right here. This is an AU, written by the author herself. That's right, we are branching into the Twilight expanded universe. Forget canon. It takes place within the Twilight universe, but it's not meant to be canon with the original 4 books. It's an alternate reality that asks the question, what would have happened had the vampire been a girl and the human been a boy? Now, I will admit to you that I was simultaneously most excited and most terrified to read this book for this series. If you're new here, I'm doing videos on all of the Twilight books. I was excited and scared. Excited because I'd never read this book before. I hadn't even heard of it. So I'm always going to be excited for a Twilight book I haven't read because that's super cool to me. I grew up reading Twilight. I'm a lifelong Twilight fan at this point. So the idea of getting to read Twilight books that I'd never read before in The Short Second Life of Bree Tanner and Life and Death was super exciting to me. Now, The Short Second Life of Bree Tanner ended up being somewhat disappointing for me just because I didn't really feel like there was any substance to it, if that makes sense. But with this one, it's a fictionalized retelling of the original story. And it's long. In fact, it's 100 pages longer than the original Twilight. So it has room to have a little bit more meat and potatoes than The Short Second Life of Bree Tanner. However, again, I'll reiterate, it asks the question, what would have happened had the vampire been a girl and a human been a boy? And it came out in 2015, and it just, it scared me a little bit of, what does it mean to Stephenie Meyer for there to be a gender swap here? What does she think is going to be different about these characters once their genders are swapped? And I was very afraid that I was going to end up forced to read. And by forced, I mean completely of my own volition and decision. I am the boss of this channel after all. But that I was going to force myself to read Gender Roles, the novel. Because otherwise, it's well, what would be different if the vampire was a girl and the human was a boy? What would have been different about the plot? That doesn't really make sense to me. So color me surprised when I opened to the preface of this book, and Miss Stephenie Meyer wrote a whole preface for this book that says basically the exact same thing I just said, which is, hey, plot-wise, doesn't really make a difference. The whole thing would have gone down exactly the same had the vampire been a girl and the human been a boy. Okay, well then what are we doing here? What is this book? Why are we here, Stephenie? In this preface, she expresses that most of her motivation in writing this is actually in response to criticism about Bella, the character. Some of the criticism that she received was that Bella was the classic damsel in distress. She was just in trouble through the whole original 4 books. She always needed Edward to come in and save her. She could never do anything for herself. She could never save herself. It wasn't feminist enough. And given 2015, feminist politics and conversations happening at the time, I could totally see a bunch of people kind of coming after Stephenie Meyer for that. We've evolved a little bit in our conversations about feminism since then, thank God. But Stephenie's response to this is that Bella was not a damsel in distress. She was just a human in distress, and has always been adamant that a boy in Bella's shoes would have been going through the exact same thing. A boy with very, very sweet smelling blood that smells just delicious to vampires would be a target for vampires and therefore would find themselves in a lot of situations where they're being hunted by vampires, and a human could never be expected to protect themselves against a vampire. The other criticism that she was kind of using this book to respond to is the idea that Bella was too obsessed with her love interest, which is something that the people delivering this criticism were chalking up to being a girl thing. Now, I don't know, based off of how Stephenie Meyer worded the sentence, whether or not people were criticizing Stephenie Meyer along the same lines of saying that Bella was too much of a damsel in distress. She was too much of a damsel in distress, and she also was too boy crazy, and these things combined make her not the most feminist character. Or if the people saying this is a strictly girl thing were saying well, yeah, Bella acts like a classic girl where she's so obsessed with her love interest, but that's not something that's interesting to me because I'm enlightened and I could never like the same things a 12-year-old girl likes because by nature of it being enjoyed by 12-year-old girls, that means it's stupid and dumb. So I don't actually know what angle that criticism was coming in at because she didn't really elaborate. She just said that those were the 2 points of criticism that she kind of wanted to respond to. She had always said that the plot would go down the exact same way if the human had been a boy, that it had more to do with the fact that Bella was a human and that Edward was a vampire, and that the whole thing's about the obsession of young love, and Edward is just as in love with Bella as Bella is with Edward from the start, kind of out of nowhere and super overwhelmingly. So it is interesting that people were saying that they thought that was like strictly a girl trait, or that Stephenie Meyer was trying to say that was like a trait of young girls. Again, I don't know exactly what angle that criticism was coming in at. So anyway, the point of this book to Stephenie Meyer was not to actually take another crack at the original story and write like a different plot of what could have happened just in a different way, just like the exact premise of Twilight, but just a little bit different maybe. It's the original story with the names and the pronouns swapped. In fact, she took basically all of the characters and gender swapped them with a few key exceptions. The first being Charlie and Renee. She kept Charlie and Renee exactly how they are because she felt like the book takes place, I think in like, shoot, I'm gonna butcher this, it's like 2005 or something, it says in the preface, hang on, or foreword, not preface, excuse me, in the foreword. By the way, their names are Beau and Edythe. Awful. Edythe I can like kind of forgive, but Beau is like, it's Beaufort, but it's spelled like B-E-A-U, so I don't know if it's supposed to be Boo or Beau, but I'm just gonna go with Beau because Beau sounds more like a name to me. Apologies if your name is Boo. I didn't mean any offense. I'm gonna call him Beau. She goes on to say that Beau was born in 1987 and that the way that family dynamics and family politics were at the time, Bella had a mom who was really unreliable and flighty, and that's part of what led to a lot of how Bella's character is, while her dad is very stable and actually quite a good dad and a responsible dad, but she wasn't raised by her dad, she was raised by her mom. Now she says that this is actually reasonable. That page just turned by itself. At the time, it was realistic that Renee would still have gotten custody of Bella because of the way the family courts were. A single mom was a lot more likely to get full custody of a child than a single dad if they couldn't do split custody because they were living in different states. And so, because Beau is supposed to be just a male version of Bella, she wanted a lot of them to have the same experiences. That meant needing to be raised by a very flighty parent, forcing them to become very responsible at a very early age. But she thought it wasn't really realistic given the era that a man who was very flighty would have ended up with full custody of a child, especially if there was a responsible and stable mother that wanted full custody of the child as well. This makes sense. I understand what she's saying. I also think she could have just like changed the plot a little bit. Like she's not handcuffed into doing literally exactly what she did before, and she could have had Beau become responsible for other reasons. There are other things that children can experience when they're young that can mature them. So I don't think it had to be that she had a flighty parent, but I don't think she needed to gender flip every single character either. I do think that was a little bit obnoxious. Well, the whole book's obnoxious. We'll get to how I feel about it. I don't get what the point of this is. I don't get why we're here, but it doesn't matter. The point is that Charlie and Renee are the same. Otherwise, every other character is gender flipped and they have a different name, with one other exception. And I will share what the exception is, but not right now. Cliffhanger. You're just gonna have to watch more of the video. Sorry. You have to remember, her whole point in doing this is that she's saying the plot wouldn't have been any different, but she's obviously writing a whole other book. They can't just republish the original book with all the names switched and be like, see, everything's the same. So she did add stuff, she rewrote stuff, she changed some of the scenes like just a little bit. And so she goes on to address why she would have done that, even though her whole point is that it wouldn't have been different. She says, 5% of the changes I made were because Beau is a boy. 5% of the changes were because Beau's personality develops just slightly differently than Bella's. The biggest variations are that he's more OCD, he's not nearly so flowery with his words and thoughts, and he's not as angry. He's totally missing the chip Bella carries around on her shoulder all of the time. I would actually agree with that, having read the book now. 70% of the changes I made were because I was allowed to do a new editing run 10 years later. I got to fix almost every word that has bothered me since the book was printed, and it was glorious. So basically what she's saying here, there's a little bit more, I'll keep reading in a second, but basically what she's saying is the majority of the things that she changed because they bothered her from the original print. So it was her being able to go back and fix moments that she thought the language was choppy, or she feels like she should have written something differently just to make it sound better or read nicer. That's why most of the changes were made, according to her. 10% were things I wished I had done the first time around, but that hadn't occurred to me at the time. That might sound like the same thing as the preceding category, but it's slightly different. This isn't a case of a word that sounds clunky or awkward. This is an idea that I wish had been explored earlier, or conversations that should have happened but didn't. So again, kind of amending things a little bit. 5% were mythology issues, mistakes actually, mostly related to visions. As I continued into the sequels to Twilight and even Midnight Sun, where I got to look inside Alice's head with Edward, which is interesting because I double checked because I want to make sure I'm making these videos in the right order. This book did get published before Midnight Sun. So I don't know when this, what was it called again? Forward was added, but it was after Midnight Sun was published. So I don't know, because she's mentioning Midnight Sun by name. And I don't think at the time that this came out, like I think people knew that she was working. Well, actually, did we have the title? People knew that she was working on Twilight from Edward's perspective, and a lot of it got leaked. So I wonder if when the draft got leaked, the name of it got leaked as well. I'm not entirely sure on that. So maybe it hadn't been published yet, but she's certainly talking about it like it's the past tense. But this came out in 2015 and Midnight Sun came out in 2020. I remember that very vividly. I remember it getting published. I know it was 2020. The way Alice's visions worked was refined. It's more mystical in Twilight, and looking at it now, there are ways she should have been involved and wasn't. Whoops. So I guess like she's saying that the way Alice's visions worked in the original 4 books is just a little bit like mystical and like whatever. And people were pointing out that Alice could have been more useful in a bunch of different ways. And so in this book, the Alice like equivalent, whose name is Archie, is more involved in the way that Stephenie Meyer realized she maybe should have been in the original 4 books. And then there's the last bullet, which says, which leaves a 5% catch-all for the many miscellaneous changes that I made, each for a different and no doubt selfish reason. So I'm left again wondering, what is the point? I don't know how I feel, because I agree with Stephenie Meyer. Gender isn't as distinct as many imagine it to be, and there's no reason why the exact plot of Twilight wouldn't have happened the exact same way that it did if the vampire was a girl and the human was a boy. So it's not that I feel strongly that the plot would go down different and so it should have been different, and that she needs to make Beau more of a man, and men don't get rescued by women, no way. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I also didn't particularly want to read just Twilight with different names and different pronouns. What this really feels like to me is that she wanted to do an editing run to fix some of the things that used to bother her, to amend some things, and also because the ending is a little bit different. I'm showing my hand a little bit here, but I want to talk about the end of the book just slightly, just to say that it's different. She did do something different with the ending, and then there's an afterword in which she talks about how she kind of lied a little bit in the foreword about exactly why she wrote this book, and that the different ending has a little bit to do with it. There's always been this like what if in her head of if the book had ended that way instead of the way that the original one did. So there's that aspect as well. So it seems like Stephenie Meyer's motivation for doing it more had to do with wanting to do all this editing and then wanting to have a different ending that she explored that could have been a possible ending of the original book, but wasn't what she went with. And then the publisher let her do it because it's another Twilight book and they can make money off of it. For them, it's a cash grab. I'm not saying for Stephenie Meyer it was a cash grab, but for the publisher, definitely. Neither of these things really makes for a fantastic reading experience. I'm fine with the original Twilight. I'm not bothered by any clunky language. Any author given the opportunity to edit their own book like a decade later would probably change a million things that not one single reader noticed. So if anything, let this be a lesson to you if you are an author. Do not get so caught up in the things that you think other people are super caught on or noticing or are bothered by, because nobody's going to be as critical of your writing as you are. But I'll admit to you that all of this led up to me not being the most excited to read this book, and I kept putting it off. I'll admit it. But this isn't the only thing that we need to unpack before we dive into the actual plot. Every one of the Twilight books has a quote in the beginning that is a reference to another famous work of literature. The book then tends to be either heavily inspired by or a retelling of whatever story the quote is from. For example, the original Twilight isn't a Genesis retelling, but it has a quote from Genesis, and there's a lot of themes from Genesis throughout the novel. And then with New Moon is a Romeo and Juliet retelling. So for those first 2 books, the quotes were heavily referenced throughout the book in different ways. And basically since New Moon, I feel like she's just been finding a quote of a book that's like relatively similar to the plot and going with it. This book references 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is a mid-1800s French adventure novel. I will admit to you, I have not read it, and I'm not going to, but I did read the Wikipedia page. It's about a group of sailors/soldiers that are sent out to attack this sea monster, except when they get to the sea monster, they find out that it's not, in fact, a sea monster. It's a super futuristic submarine, and nobody knows where it came from. But it has this captain, Captain Nemo, and I think I can loosely understand where the reference is based off of this paragraph from the Wikipedia page. The rest of the novel describes the protagonist's adventures aboard the Nautilus, which was built in secrecy and now roams the seas beyond the reach of land-based governments. In self-imposed exile, Captain Nemo seems to have a dual motivation: a quest for scientific knowledge and a desire to escape terrestrial civilization. Nemo explains that a submarine is electrically powered and can conduct advanced marine research. He also tells his new passengers that his secret existence means he cannot let them leave. They must remain on board permanently. Edythe is Captain Nemo, and Bo is, I guess, all of the soldiers combined. Being pulled into and made aware of her world also makes it so that he is never allowed to leave it. This will make sense when we talk about what the new ending of the book is. This is fine, I guess. I get why the reference is there. Now, like I said, have not read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, so I honestly don't know. I mean, for all I know, there's a million references to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in here, and I just missed them because I have not read the book. And I'll admit to you, I didn't even read the Wikipedia page until after I finished reading Life and Death. So there could have been references to it. I don't know. I don't know that that's a super common book for people to have read, but I also don't think that necessarily invalidates it as a choice. If she did choose it and she did reference it a bunch and I just missed those, cool, more power to her. I can't really speak to whether or not it was like really used throughout the narrative. I can just see the parallel of Captain Nemo being like, well, now that you know about me, you have to stay on board or die. And then knowing the ending of this book and being like, okay, I see the parallel. I've rambled enough. Okay, we have a Twilight gender-bended retelling with Edythe and Bo. Let's get into the book itself. So this book does basically have the exact same plot as Twilight, except for the ending. However, it's 100 pages longer. Where did those come from? What's on those pages? I very quickly found out, okay? She didn't change any of the plot. She just added a ton of fluff. And when I say she added fluff, I don't mean she added scenes. She didn't add any scenes. She just made every scene that was in the original book longer. On the surface, this is a bad idea. Any good editor will tell you that editing a book should make it shorter. Your book should get shorter with every draft, unless you're like me and you know your first draft isn't filled out all the way and you need to add chapters, but that's its own thing. Editing a book should always make it shorter, not longer. So at first I was annoyed with the extra. And when I would read that there was like an extra paragraph or two, especially because she did rip so much of the writing from the original book. So I'd be reading a scene that was relatively familiar to me and I knew the language, only for there to then be like one or two paragraphs that were different and then to like move back into exactly how she wrote it from the first book. It was weird. I was admittedly annoyed. I already went into it like, I don't get what the point of this is. I don't really want to read it. And then I realized that the reason it was longer is just because she padded it with a bunch of extra crap that was just like flowery language. There weren't even like new scenes. However, I can be wrong and I can admit when I'm wrong. What this extra time, extra fluff, extra pages are used for, overarchingly throughout the book, is to add more flirting and more bonding between Bo and Edythe. One of the main criticisms of the original book is that Edward and Bella ended up just obsessed with each other and there isn't really a ton of reasoning why. She figures out that he's a vampire and then it's just like, I'm in love with him. And they've spoken like maybe 5 times at that point. I mean, he had saved her life, to be fair, but still. It's just weird. It's weird how attached they were to each other so quickly. And so there's more like buildup here. There's more time with them actually conversing to each other and with them like speaking and flirting. All of the scenes where we see Edward and Bella interact from the original book are just expanded upon, and they have longer conversations and they flirt a little bit more in those conversations and they're a little bit cutesier with each other. So in a way, I think it actually ended up being a pretty good change. She also made Edythe way less angry than Edward and a lot less emotionally manipulative. I'm going to be very kind here, okay? I'm going to be very charitable. I do not think that this had anything to do with Edythe being a woman. The other biggest criticism of the original series is that Edward, especially in book 1 and book 2 and like halfway through book 3, so I guess like the majority of the series, is very temperamental. He's very controlling over Bella. He gets really angry with her for like the smallest things, and his personality will just flip on a dime, and then he'll like jump away from her and get really upset and be all like moody and broody. And that's like textbook emotional manipulation. Hot and cold interactions like that is like genuinely something out of a textbook. So dulling those aspects of her personality, it makes sense to me. Like, I think if she were to go back and fix the original Twilight, she would make the same changes to Edward because of the criticism of his character. I think these are just changes that she probably wanted to make to Edward's character, and this was her opportunity to do so, even if it isn't technically Edward. She also does still stalk Beau, and I couldn't remember when that comes up in the original book, and so I feel like I reached a point in the reread where I was like, oh, maybe she doesn't stalk him. Maybe she wasn't like waiting outside of his house or in his room or like hanging out watching him sleep without his permission or consent. Like, maybe she just doesn't do that in this book. Maybe Stephenie Meyer just completely removed that. No. That still exists. That still happens. But the way that Beau finds out about it felt softer to me in this book. It felt better to me than it feels when I reread the original Twilight, and I can't exactly put into words why. I don't know if it's just because there was so much more fluff, so I was so much further into the book when that plot point gets sprung, and it feels like they bonded a lot more. But no matter how much they bonded, it's weird for her to have done that without his permission. So I wish she had just taken it out, and I don't know why she didn't, if she was willing to go through and change all these other things that she had gotten so much criticism over. Like, why would she not have just fixed that as well? But who's to say? Who's to say? No one's in her mind, no one's in her heart. So overall, upon finishing it, I was really torn about how I felt about it. This book was a very strange reading experience. It felt very familiar, yet very alien. Stephenie Meyer's voice was so strong, and it certainly read and felt like a Twilight novel, but then I had to remember that all of the genders are flipped, all of the names are different, except for Charlie. So I got Charlie, who I'm very familiar with. We love Charlie. We love Charlie on this channel. So I'm reading all about Charlie, and then every other character is exactly opposite. It was a real mindfuck. I had to think real hard at points in this book to like remember who somebody was supposed to be. But that being said, I do feel like the relationship is actually a lot more fleshed out in this version of the book, and the fluff does make for a more seamless reading experience. Sometimes you need a little bit of that, you know? So for me, as a big fan of the original work and someone who grew up reading it, and I've probably reread the original 4 books, I'm not joking, at least 15 times at this point over the course of my life. And that's an underestimate, okay? This used to be like all I read in middle school, just like over and over and over again. It was really weird and sometimes a lot of brain power for me to read, but when I got into the flow of it and I got used to it, I do think that this is a better written book than Twilight is on the surface. I do think that Twilight has a lot of really interesting references to Genesis that, again, like the references to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea could have been in this book, and I just didn't pick up on it because I hadn't read that book. I don't know, but I do think from a reading experience perspective, this book is a better quality than the original, but I'm such a big fan of the original, and it was so hard to keep it straight and balanced in my mind and like to remember what I was reading. And I'd see a name and be like, wait, who is that? And I'd have to think about it for like a minute. It was very odd, but the quality of the book is a little bit better. So do with that information what you will. I don't know. But with that, we can start to unpack my individual notes about specific things that happened throughout the book. Full spoilers, by the way. First of all, the names for the family, for Edythe's family, horrendous. Okay? Ahem. He muttered his answer under his breath. Those are the Cullens and the Hales. Edythe and Eleanor Cullen, Jessamine and Royal Hale. The one who left was Archie Cullen. They live with Dr. Cullen and her husband. So Edythe, wait, it's spelled wrong here. Oh, that's kind of a fun touch. I just realized this. Hang on. We're inside of Beau's internal monologue, and I remember in a few pages, Edythe's name is spelled E-D-Y-T-H-E, but it's spelled E-D-I-T-H here. That's kind of a fun little touch. I specifically remember him being like, oh, I have the spelling of it wrong. So it's fun that like in his internal monologue, it was spelled wrong. I like that. Small points for that as I'm about to talk shit about all these names. So Edythe is Edward, right? Eleanor is Emmett. Never fear, she is a muscle mommy. She maintains the Emmett physique. I don't know if she eats the egg bag. My friends already asked me. That's not directly mentioned, so I can't tell you if the muscle mommy version of Emmett also just eats a bag of hard-boiled eggs for lunch, allegedly. Well, we know he drinks animal blood, but is trying to lead the humans to believe that his lunch is a bag of hard-boiled eggs. Is her lunch a bag of hard-boiled eggs? I don't know. Jessamine. That's Jasper. Just name him Jessica. And then Royal. Rosalie's male name is Royal. I don't know. Robert? What are we doing here? Russell? Like Richard? Rosalo? I don't know, dude. I just feel like there are so many boy R names. Like there's a lot of boy R names out there. Why we went from Rosalie to Royal, I have no idea. Especially because she doesn't seem attached to keeping any of the other letters or even how long the name is in comparison to the other names. It literally only has to start with the same first letter. Because you have Eleanor, which is supposed to be Emmett. She could have gone with Emily if the EM was really important, but she didn't. She picked Eleanor. Jessamine. That's nothing. I mean, Jasper, Jessamine, I guess it sounds just, again, Jessica. Jessica was available to us. I guess Jessica was a character from the original book, but Jasmine, Jenna, Jocelyn, like you had options. And Royal, I'll never get over that. Royal. Every time he popped up, I was like, dude, are you serious? Archie's fine. I have no problem with Archie as an Alice opposite. And then Esme's name is Ernest. That isn't mentioned until later, and Carlisle's name is Kareen. Ernest, I don't mind at all. Ernest is an old style name for men. Cool. Kareen, also strange, but Carlisle has always had a strange name. Truthfully. I don't know. I just feel like we could have picked better names. The first big deviation that we see from the original plot comes from when Beau goes to Port Angeles. In the original Twilight, Bella almost gets sexually assaulted by a group of men. In this version of events, Beau almost gets murdered by some nefarious criminals because he's like walking past the alley and they see him and then they just like think he's a cop, and so then they corner him and they're gonna like kill him because they think he's a cop. I don't like this change, to be honest. First of all, men get assaulted. There's no reason to think that a drunk group of men wouldn't corner a young boy and assault him the same that they might corner a young girl. But also, you expect me to believe that career criminals saw a 17-year-old walking past the alley and was like, that's a cop for sure, and then chased him out of the alley, down the street, cornered him, and we're gonna shoot him with a gun, and for what? Like, why would they do that? It was so unbelievable to me. But at least it was a different scene from the original book, and so I got to read something that was more different than just with slightly different changes. So I'm not gonna complain too much, but it was just a really strange choice. I don't understand why it was made. Then we get to page 177, and this is the biggest crime in this whole entire book. She changed the line, you know the line that's on the back of the original Twilight book was important enough to the original story that it's on the back of the book, and then also on the back of the white reprint. Here I have a black paperback copy of the original. I have a white paperback copy of the original. A dust jacket for the original in hardcover. On the back of all three, about 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how potent that part might be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. She changed the line. Class, if you have this book, turn to page 177. I don't know if you do. There were a few things I knew for sure. Hang on, wait. So we went from about 3 things I was absolutely positive to there were a few things I knew for sure. It's worse. Like, she changed it and she made it worse. Anyway, there were a few things I knew for sure. For one, Edythe was an actual vampire. For another, there was a part of her that saw me as food, but in the end, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that I loved her more than I'd ever imagined it was possible to love anything. She was everything I wanted, the only thing I would ever want. She changed it and she made it worse. It's like writing wise, like she made the writing of it worse. This original line, as goofy as it is, as like dramatic as it is, it's a young adult novel. Young adult novels, especially young adult romances, are goofy and dramatic. Okay, so that doesn't bother me. That's not a problem. About 3 things I was absolutely positive is a very clear sentence. Hang on, I gotta get back to page 177. There were a few things I knew for sure is a lot less absolute than about 3 things I was absolutely positive. Then it just goes first, second, third in the way it breaks down all of the points. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him and I didn't know how oh, this is dominant. Wait, we've discovered something strange live in the middle of filming. What does this one say? Okay, so when I was like reading my goofy thing, I was reading the back of the white copy. I had all three of them like held in my hands as part of the bit, but I was actually reading off the white copy. And this says, there was a part of him and I didn't know how potent that part might be that thirsted for my blood. But on the back of the hardcover dust jacket I have here, it says, second, there was a part of him and I didn't know how dominant that part might be that thirsted for my blood. On the paperback, oh shit, on the paperback also says dominant. Well, now I gotta find the page in, hang on. That's 177 in here, which means it'll be before 177 in here. Okay, so in the white copy, in the actual book, it does say potent. Page 159. It says potent here. So we're on page 195 of the black paperback. This one also says potent, but it says dominant on the back. I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see this. It might be too bright with the lights, but do you see? Do you see it says potent? But on the back it says dominant. Do you see that? What? Now I got to get the hardcover out. Hang on. We've lost the plot of this video. I'm off track. Give me a second. Okay, the reason that I don't have the hardcover dust jacket on my hardcover copy of the original book is because I bought these cool dust jackets. I got sold by an Instagram ad. They're from Nerdy Ink. But anyway, what page did I say that was? 195. Let's see if it's the same in here. It is. This one says potent as well. So for some reason within the book, it says potent, but on the back of both the hardcover and the paperback of the original, it says dominant instead of potent. But on the white copy on the back, it does say potent. This information means nothing, and yet somehow I feel like foundationally my life has changed. But we're just gonna slide right back into talking about life and death, because I don't really know how to transition out of this whole rant. Beau makes a show of carrying Edythe's backpack, which I thought was really funny for two reasons. One, because that 100% is absolutely a classic high school boyfriend thing. Like, carrying your girlfriend's backpack was seen as like such a romantic thing to do. So it makes sense that she included it as a detail, but I don't remember Edward doing that for Bella. I could be wrong. We know my memory's fallible. So for all I know, Edward does carry Bella's backpack around and I just like forgot that part. But I do think it's really funny if Edward didn't really carry Bella's backpack around, because there's this added layer of like, he's a vampire and he's like eternally strong. He's like so much stronger than the average human. And so she's not nearly as strong as him, but he's not carrying her backpack. But Beau, who's a weak human, wants to carry his beautiful, wonderful vampire girlfriend's backpack, even though she's like infinitely stronger than him. There is something very funny to me about that, but I could be remembering wrong. Maybe Edward does carry Bella's backpack. I don't know. On page 195, my note just says wet dream implication. I don't remember what this is. So they're flirting and she says, but you're only conscious for roughly 16 hours in any given 24-hour period. That gives me quite a lead, don't you think? And Beau says, you're not factoring in dreams though. She sighed. Do nightmares count as dreams? Red started creeping up my neck. When I dream about you, it's definitely not a nightmare. Her mouth opened just a tiny bit in surprise and her face was suddenly vulnerable. Really? She asked. It was obvious that she was pleased, so I said every single night. And then they go on to keep flirting. But I feel like there was something else that he said at some point. I don't know. I feel like at some point he was like embarrassed, but maybe he could have just been embarrassed to admit that he was having any type of dreams about her. But for some reason, when I was reading it, I felt like it was implying that he'd had like a sex dream about her. But upon my reread of the passage, I think I was filling in that a little bit, truthfully. But I will say this book is very horny, but I'm not going to say that it's hornier than the original Twilight, because I very distinctly remember upon rereading the original Twilight as an adult being surprised by how horny it was. I thought it was going to be like not horny at all, but Bella's like quite horny, actually. Bella's like very horny for Edward. So this book was very horny, but I'm not going to say it's hornier. I would have to like sit and compare, but I think we're about at equal horniness, in my opinion. Those are all the distinct, I mean, I took a bunch more notes, but most of them were boring. Otherwise, the book's just Twilight, but a little longer and slightly different ending. So we're gonna get to talking about that now. Instead of surviving the attack at the dance studio, Beau is either going to die or get turned into a vampire. And they ask him in the moment, and of course he's like, I want to become a vampire, I want to be with you forever. So he chooses to become a vampire. This ending was a super fun change And it really brought life into the reread for me. When I got to that part, I was like, whoa, this is really cool. And I was really excited to read those last few chapters as a result. She showed how they faked Beau's death so that his family wouldn't know. So it's very different from in Bella's situation. Bella is able to maintain contact with at least Charlie. It's never really explained what she's going to do about Renee, her mom, but at least Charlie does get to keep being in her life at least as long as he's alive. She will obviously outlive Charlie, so that will be sad, but she gets to spend time with Charlie during his human life. While in this version of events, both Charlie and Renee believe that Beau died in a car accident. And Stephenie Meyer says in the afterword, where she says like, oh, I didn't want to talk about this in the foreword, obviously, because it would be a huge spoiler, but I wanted to break down a little bit about why I did this. She says that this isn't to say that that's how she wished she ended the original book. It's just always kind of been a what if for her. Like, what if Bella became a vampire in that moment instead of staying human? And then the other three books obviously either would have gone down completely differently or they wouldn't have existed at all. And there had always been this what if in Stephenie Meyer's mind. So when she got the opportunity to redo the original book, she decided to include Beau becoming a vampire instead of staying human at the end and exploring what that actually would have looked like as just a theoretical what if. And goes on to remark that the extra time really allows Bella to like get her affairs in order and get married to Edward and kind of set everything up the way she wants it to be so that she can be with Edward and be a vampire but still keep Charlie in her life and still hang out with Jacob sometimes and all of that. Whereas in this version of events, Beau doesn't really get the opportunity to prep all of that. So he doesn't go through nearly as much pain as Bella does because Bella's human life involved a lot more fear and a lot more pain than Beau's did. He just didn't go through all of the stuff that Bella goes through after the original book. But as a result, he sacrifices Charlie. This part was actually very sad to read. I felt bad for Charlie. I wish they could have told him, especially because Bonnie, who's this book's version of, what's Jacob's dad's name in the original book? Billy? Yeah, that's right, Billy. Bonnie is Billy, and Bonnie knows because of the whole werewolf thing that comes up at the end as well. The werewolves come through and they kind of talk to them about the treaty and things like that, and so they end up talking to Bonnie, and it was sad, but it was cool. It was just cool to see a different version of the ending. And overall, when I finished the book, my opinion was like, okay, fine. This book was kind of pointless. I guess it was fine. Until Edythe is explaining the Volturi to Beau towards the end of the book, because Beau has to learn all these things because Beau hasn't had the experiences that Bella's had, and Bella didn't know about any of that kind of stuff in that first book. When Edythe is explaining the Volturi to Beau, we see the only place in this book, besides Charlie and Renee, where there hasn't been a gender swap, and that's with the story of the Volturi. So instead of it being Marcus, Caius, and Arrow, Marcus is still there, but the other two lead members of the Volturi are actually the wives of Arrow and Caius. And way back when the Volturi was forming, those wives staged a coup against Arrow and Caius, and they ended up the masters of the Volturi instead of Arrow and Caius. So that was the only other thing she changed. Or I guess not changed. That was the only other thing she kept the same, but in a way felt like a change because of what she was doing with the rest of the book. And she goes on to say in the afterward, like, it's up to you to decide whether or not this version of the Volturi was a lot more fair than the others. She thinks it would be. But when I read that, I retroactively started to feel like this book was a giant missed opportunity. And to be fair, that feeling didn't come in at the end until I read this part. And like I said, my initial opinion was like, okay, fine. Do I think this book had a point? No. But did I hate reading it? Also no. Do I recommend it? I have no idea. It's the original Twilight with a lot more fluff in it. I think it's objectively a little bit better written, but I also think that the original Twilight just like holds something so special for me. And if you are a Twilight fan, I don't know that you're going to get a lot out of reading this, truthfully. So honestly, I don't know. You've watched up to this point in the video. You make your own choice. Do you want to read it or not? It's up to you. But when I read this part, a sudden different version of this book formed in my mind. What if, instead of a full gender swap of every single character in the whole entire book, she did something like what she did with the Volturi, where one small change has a ripple effect that makes the eventual outcome, or I guess premise of the original book different. So it's not that we have Edward and Bella and their opposite genders, but maybe we've created the same situation as the original Twilight, but not with Edward and Bella, with a different male human and a different female vampire, but then every other character is kind of the same. Especially because she's spoken about how obsessed she is with the idea of different choices changing the future, and that's part of what she was exploring with Alice's powers throughout the entire duration of the original 4 books, is the idea that the future isn't set in stone and that our choices in the present day affect how the future plays out. So she could have changed little things about the events leading up to the original book to have created the same premise, but instead with a female vampire and a male human, but then they wouldn't be like gender-bedded Edward and Bella. It would just be a slightly different situation, but then every other character is the same. You see what I'm saying? So it could be something as simple as Carlisle decides to save somebody different from the Spanish influenza, but I think that's kind of boring. When Edward leaves Carlisle for his little Dexter side plot, when he's drinking human blood, but it's only from monstrous humans, he kills like murderers, basically. He's a vampire vigilante. What if he never comes back? What if that's just his life now? And what if that's the life Edward is living? She even could have thrown in a fun little line about maybe Edward and Bella meet in a different situation. Like, it could have been mentioned that Edward and Bella found each other at some point. Even if Edward and Bella aren't the main characters in this book, maybe they come at the end and like join the Cullens. And that could be the moment where Edward's like, all right, I want back into your life because I found this human and I really love her, but it's hard to be around her when I'm drinking human blood all the time. And I really wanted to, wait, no. What if Edward brings Bella to Carlisle to turn her into a vampire because he doesn't feel like he's strong enough, especially because he's been surviving off of human blood? And so that happens at the end of the book. So we find out that Edward and Bella have met in a different situation and they still end up together. That's kind of fun. And then Carlisle saved somebody else because he was lonely. And this is before Esme was around. And that's the vampire that ends up single in Forks. And then you can either make them lesbians, but I guess that doesn't really work if we're still going to have Bella and Edward meet. Or you have the new female vampire character fall in love with either a different human from the original story. So you could pick any male human from the original story, like a Mike or I don't forget what those guys' names are. I only remember Mike for some reason. But the most fun, and the thing that really, really got my heart beating when I thought about it, hear me out, a little bit of a forbidden love between them and Jacob. So it's like the original story, but instead of Bella and Edward, it's whatever vampire Carlisle saved after Edward left because he was still really lonely. And that female vampire and Jacob fall in love. I'm just saying, that would be fun. That would be fun, would it not? But then I guess that kind of defeats her whole purpose about like wanting to show that the human would still be really weak. But maybe it could have been a pair of books, and it could have been Jacob as a human having this forbidden romance with this female vampire. And then there could have been a second book where he becomes a werewolf and then they have to like deal with that. That could have been really fun. And all of a sudden, that's what I wish this book was. But alas, this is the book she decided to write, and I give it a resounding... Like I already kind of said, I don't really know if I recommend this book or not. If you've watched this whole entire video, you know basically all of my thoughts about it, and you can make your own decision about whether or not it's a book you want to read. If you were just interested in hearing about Life and Death, then go ahead and click out of the video. But if you want a little life update, channel update, I guess, I don't know if you guys noticed, the footage looks a little different. I bought a camera. Finally, she's a real YouTuber. She owns a camera. I was really excited about it right when I first bought it. And I have you guys to thank because I saved up all the money that I was making off of the channel and I used it to buy the camera. So I love you guys. Thank you. And so I wanted to tell you that I bought it and obviously explain why the footage looks a little bit different. I was super excited when I got it. That excitement has slowly gone down a little bit because it's actually really hard to make a shot look good. You would not believe how I filmed this video today. The sun has gone down, so we've gotten darker and darker behind me here. What you're seeing, based off of what I'm seeing in the viewfinder here behind me, this is how dark the whole entire room is, and sort of has been the whole entire time I've been filming. I have been really struggling to actually set up my lights in a way that looks good, because I either can light myself really well, so I'm super visible, or I can light the room, but then I look awful. I don't know what the problem is. I just don't have enough lights, or bright enough lights, or good enough lights, I don't know, diffused enough lights to light myself well and also light the room. And so I think I just need to get better lights or more lights, I don't know. But I even tried filming in front of the window, and honestly the footage looked really, really bad. And I was about to give up. I was about to just film this video on my phone again, like I've been doing for all my other videos, and just make my peace with the fact that I was gonna have to mess with the camera like all next week too, to like try and get something to look good or go buy some lights or something, I don't know. And then something within me decided to try filming in low light, because I got the Sony a7C, and one of this camera's like claim to fame, and one of the things that everybody was like saying about it is that it's really, really good in low light. So I was like, well, what if I just didn't use the lights at all and I just cranked the ISO? Maybe then I can get it to look relatively okay. And believe it or not, I don't know how this footage is going to look on my big screen. It looked okay to me, so hopefully the footage is usable, but I cannot believe, like, I'm basically being lit by my monitors here. And I have been the whole entire video. Like, that's what we went with, because that looked the best of everything I tried. So definitely comment your feedback. I'd love to hear it, but I am grateful. I don't mean to make it sound like I'm not excited about the camera. I know the videos are going to look way better. And my goal is to have just a permanent setup, to have it just there so that I can just turn everything on, film, and then turn everything off. That would make my life so much easier. So that's the plan. That's the hope. I just have to get there. But I just wanted to tell you guys how much I appreciate you subscribing and watching the videos, because it's because of you guys that I can get exciting new year like this. Also, Happy New Year. I hope you all are doing well. I'm super duper excited for the new year. I can't wait for all the content I have planned for you guys. We're gonna have so much fun. So definitely subscribe if you aren't subscribed, because you're gonna miss out on some pretty fun content. If you don't, just saying. That's gonna be all for me today, you guys. I love you so much. Happy New Year, like I said. I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.